I leaned on the porch railing, coffee warming my hands against the crisp morning air. The house before me had been my sanctuary for over 30 years. I built it myself, every nail and beam, back when Rebecca and I were just starting out. Those were the days, simpler times when we spent evenings dreaming of the future. But now, something felt different. The house hadn't changed much, but the life inside it? That was another story. Lately, Rebecca had been distant. It started small, less time together, fewer heartfelt conversations. Then came the excuses, late nights at the foundation, early meetings, sudden trips. I told myself it was just her dedication to work, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't go away. This morning was no different. She grabbed her keys, barely looking at me. "Got an early meeting today," she said, brushing a quick kiss on my cheek. "Don't wait up tonight, I might be late again." "Another meeting?" I asked casually. She nodded, already halfway out the door. "Big project coming up. I'll tell you all about it later." I watched her black sedan pull out of the driveway, the sound of tires crunching on gravel fading into the morning quiet. I stayed on the porch for a while, staring at the empty street. 30 years of marriage, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through my fingers. When I walked back into the house, it felt quieter than usual. Too quiet. I wandered aimlessly into the office we shared, the faint smell of Rebecca's perfume lingering in the air. Her desk was a mess of papers and folders, as always, but an envelope caught my eye. It had the foundation's logo on it. I hesitated. Snooping wasn't my style. But the knot in my stomach urged me forward. I opened the envelope carefully and sifted through the contents: financial reports, donor lists, meeting notes. Nothing unusual, until I saw the receipt. La Belle Maison. The name hit me like a brick. It was one of the fanciest restaurants in town, the kind of place Rebecca and I used to go for special occasions. My eyes scanned the bill, at $300, including 2 wine pairings. Rebecca had told me she was at a committee meeting that evening. My chest tightened. Who was the second wine pairing for? I put the receipt back, my hands trembling slightly. Maybe it was a dinner with donors. That would explain the expense. But why hadn't she mentioned it? Rebecca loved sharing every detail about her work, at least, she used to. That night, she breezed through the door just after 10 p.m. Her makeup was flawless, her hair perfectly styled. She smelled of her favorite perfume, the one she wore for special occasions. "Sorry I'm late," she said, dropping her bag on the counter. The meeting ran long, and we stopped for coffee afterward. I forced a smile. "Sounds like a productive evening." "Oh, it was," she replied, flashing me a bright smile before heading upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen, staring at the empty doorway. My gut told me something was wrong, but I couldn't prove it. Not yet. I needed answers. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the image of that receipt burned into my mind. La Belle Maison. 2 wine pairings. Rebecca had been so convincing when she said she'd been at a committee meeting, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, Rebecca left the house early again. She kissed me lightly, her eyes darting toward her phone as it buzzed with another message. "I've got a full day at the foundation," she said. "See you tonight." I watched her drive off, the knot in my stomach tightening. I decided I couldn't ignore this anymore. Something was going on, and I needed to know what. After cleaning up the breakfast dishes, I went back into the office. I stood there for a moment, staring at Rebecca's desk. It felt strange, intrusive, to be snooping around. But the image of her laughing with someone over a fancy dinner haunted me. I opened her laptop. Her email inbox popped up, a clean and organized list of messages. Most were about the foundation, donors, volunteers, planning events. but then I saw a name that didn't fit, Edward Miller. The subject line read, "A follow-up from dinner." My chest tightened. My hand hovered over the mouse before I clicked. The email opened, and my heart sank. Rebecca. Last night was amazing. You're incredible, and I can't wait to see you again. Let me know when you have some free time. I'd love to talk more about the fundraiser, and other things. Edward? The room spun for a moment, and I had to sit down. My worst fears were unfolding before me. This wasn't just work. This wasn't just a donor dinner. I clicked through a few more emails, my pulse racing. There were others. Most of them seemed professional, but every so often, there was a comment that felt wrong. Personal. Intimate. Closing the laptop, I sat back, trying to make sense of it all. 30 years of marriage, and she was having dinner with someone else, sharing wine, sharing, what else? My hands balled into fists. I wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but this wasn't something I could ignore. By the afternoon, my mind was still racing. I couldn't concentrate on anything. I paced the living room, going over every conversation Rebecca and I had had over the past few months. The late nights, the guarded phone calls, the way she'd been dressing up more often. Had I missed the signs? I decided I needed help. My best friend, Joe Barnes, had been a private investigator before he retired. We'd known each other since high school, and he'd always been the guy I turned to when I needed advice. I grabbed my phone and dialed his number. "Michael," Joe answered, his deep voice steady as always. "What's going on?" "I need to talk to you," I said. "It's about Rebecca." There was a pause. Joe knew me too well to brush it off. "I'm free this afternoon. Come by my place." When I arrived at Joe's, he was already sitting on his porch, a cup of coffee in hand. He waved me over, his sharp eyes narrowing as he studied my face. "You look like hell," he said, motioning for me to sit. "Thanks for the vote of confidence," I replied, managing a weak smile. Joe leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What's going on with Rebecca?" I hesitated, the words sticking in my throat. Finally, I told him about the receipt, the emails, the late nights. As I spoke, Joe's expression darkened. "That doesn't sound good," he said when I finished. "You think she's cheating?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But something's not right. I need to know for sure." Joe nodded, his face set in a grim expression. "I'll help you. But you need to be ready for what you might find." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Ready? How could anyone be ready for this? But I nodded anyway. "Do whatever it takes," I said. Joe stood and clapped a hand on my shoulder. "All right. Let's find out the truth." As I drove home that evening, the knot in my stomach had turned into a heavy weight. Part of me still hoped there was a reasonable explanation. But another part of me, the part that had seen those emails, knew better. Driving back from Joe's house, I gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual. My mind raced with everything we'd discussed. Joe was no stranger to uncovering uncomfortable truths. His years as a private investigator had prepared him for situations like this. But this time, it was personal. He'd seen my family grow over the years, celebrated milestones with us, and now, he was about to help me uncover a truth I wasn't sure I wanted to face. When I got home, the house was dark. Rebecca hadn't returned yet, which didn't surprise me. Lately, her late nights had become routine. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and sank into the couch, the silence of the house pressing down on me. Joe had given me a lot to think about. "Start simple," he'd said. "Pay attention to the small details. People who are hiding something always slip up eventually." His words echoed in my head as I pulled out my phone. I opened Rebecca's text messages again, scrolling through her exchanges with Edward Miller. My jaw clenched as I reread the messages. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. Let's make this weekend unforgettable. Each line was a dagger to the heart, but Joe had been clear. I needed more than just suspicion. I needed proof. I decided to start with her schedule. Rebecca had been so busy with the foundation lately that it wouldn't be hard to track where she was spending her time. I pulled out a notepad and started jotting down the places she mentioned: meetings, donor lunches, committee work. One thing stood out: the frequency of her visits to a specific address. She'd mentioned going to a donor's office downtown multiple times over the past month. I remembered Joe's advice: if something feels off, it probably is. The next morning, I acted casual as Rebecca prepared to leave. She wore a fitted navy dress, her hair styled in loose waves. It was more effort than she usually put into her work outfits, and I couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in her demeanor. "Big meeting today?" I asked, sipping my coffee. She glanced at me with a smile. "Yeah, just the usual. Donors can be demanding." "Which donor?" I pressed, keeping my tone light. "Edward Miller," she said without missing a beat. "He's been incredibly generous, and we're finalizing some details for a project." Hearing his name out loud made my stomach churn, but I kept my expression neutral. "Sounds important. Good luck." "Thanks," she said, grabbing her bag and heading for the door. "Don't wait up tonight. It might run late." As soon as she left, I grabbed my phone and called Joe. "She's meeting Edward Miller this morning," I told him. Joe's voice was steady. "Text me the address. I'll check it out." I sent him the details and spent the rest of the morning pacing the house. My gut told me I was on the right track, but the waiting was unbearable. By the afternoon, Joe called back. "You're not going to like this," he said. My grip tightened on the phone. "What did you find?" "He's not just a donor." "That office she's been going to?" "It's not even an office, it's a luxury apartment. The guy's been renting it for months." I felt the air leave my lungs. A luxury apartment? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Joe continued, "If you want, I can set up some surveillance. Cameras, maybe even a tracker on her car. But you need to be ready for whatever we find." I hesitated. Did I want to go that far? The messages, the late nights, the apartment, it was already damning. But I needed to be sure. "Do it," I said finally. "I need the truth." That night, Rebecca came home later than usual. She breezed through the door, her cheeks flushed, and I wondered if it was from the cold or something else entirely. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "You have no idea," she replied, kicking off her heels. "The project's moving forward, but there's so much left to do." I nodded, watching her closely as she disappeared upstairs. My gut twisted, but I forced myself to stay calm. If Joe's surveillance worked, I wouldn't have to wait long for answers. As I sat on the couch, staring at the photo of us on the mantel, I felt a cold determination settle over me. Rebecca thought she could lie to me, but she was about to learn just how wrong she was. The next morning, Joe called me with an update. "I've got the cameras and the tracker set up," he said. "She won't notice a thing, but we'll know exactly where she goes and who she meets." "Thanks, Joe," I said, pacing the living room. "I just need to know. I can't keep living like this." "You'll get your answers soon enough," Joe replied. "But remember, Michael, don't do anything rash. Let's see where this leads first." I hung up the phone, feeling a mix of relief and dread. Relief that I was finally doing something, and dread for what I might discover. That evening, Rebecca left the house around 6 p.m., dressed to the nines. She wore a deep red dress I hadn't seen before, her hair perfectly styled. She didn't give me much of an explanation, just a quick, donor meeting downtown. Don't wait up. I nodded, watching her walk out the door. As soon as she was gone, I grabbed my phone and called Joe. She's on the move, I said. Got it, Joe replied. I'll let you know what I find. The hours dragged by. I couldn't focus on anything. I sat in the living room, staring at the clock, replaying every moment of the past few months in my head. The late nights, the guarded conversations, the distant looks. How had I missed the signs for so long? Just after 10 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from Joe. She's at the apartment with him. They've been inside for over an hour. My chest tightened as I read the words. I'd been hoping, praying, that this was all some terrible misunderstanding. But now, there was no denying it. Joe followed up with a call. Michael, I got footage of them entering the apartment together. It's pretty clear what's going on. I didn't respond right away. My mind was spinning, my hands shaking. Send me everything, I said finally. You sure you're ready for this? Joe asked. I need to see it, I said, my voice firm. The footage arrived a few minutes later. I opened the file with trembling hands. The video wasn't long, but it told me everything I needed to know. Rebecca and Edward arrived together, laughing as they entered the building. He held the door open for her, his hand brushing against her back. They disappeared inside, and the camera captured nothing more. I stared at the screen, my chest heaving. The knot in my stomach had turned into a raging fire. She'd lied to me. Over and over again, she'd looked me in the eyes and told me half-truths and outright lies. I felt the first flicker of anger, hot and consuming. But more than that, I felt betrayed. 30 years of marriage, and this was how it ended? But no. It wasn't going to end here. Not like this. If Rebecca thought she could deceive me and walk away unscathed, she had no idea who she was dealing with. The next morning, I met Joe at a diner on the edge of town. He slid a folder across the table, his expression grim. Everything's in here, he said. Photos, timestamps, the works. If you want to confront her, you've got all the evidence you need. I opened the folder and flipped through the photos. Each one felt like a punch to the gut. Rebecca with Edward at the apartment door. Rebecca smiling as Edward poured her a glass of wine. The two of them sitting close, their heads almost touching. Do you want me to keep going? Joe asked. I shook my head. No. This is enough. Joe leaned back in his chair, watching me carefully. What's your next move? I stared at the folder for a long moment, then closed it. I'm not confronting her yet, I said. Not until I'm ready. Joe nodded. Smart. Whatever you're planning, Michael, just be careful. I managed a small smile. Oh, I'll be careful. But they won't see it coming. The drive home from the diner felt like a blur. Joe's folder sat on the passenger seat, its contents burning a hole in my mind. Every photo, every timestamp, every piece of evidence was undeniable. Rebecca wasn't just meeting with Edward for work, she was betraying me, and she didn't even bother to hide it well. As I pulled into the driveway, the house loomed before me, silent and unwelcoming. It felt less like a home and more like a prison. My sanctuary for over 30 years was now filled with secrets and lies. I sat in the car for a while, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside me. Anger. Betrayal. Sadness. They all swirled together, threatening to consume me. But beneath it all, a cold determination took hold. If Rebecca thought she could do this to me, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. That evening, Rebecca came home late again. She walked through the door, her heels clicking against the floor, her usual polished smile in place. Hey, she said, setting her bag on the counter. How was your day? I forced a smile. Fine. How about you? Busy, she replied. You know how these meetings go. Everyone wants to talk forever. I nodded, pretending to listen, but inside, I was already planning my next move. If Joe's evidence wasn't enough to bury her and Edward, I'd make sure I had even more. The next morning, I reached out to Joe. I need a way to record them, I said. Something discreet. Joe didn't hesitate. I'll get you a voice recorder. You can plant it in her car or her bag. If they're talking, you'll hear it. By the afternoon, I had the recorder in hand. It was small, easy to hide, and would run for hours without needing to be checked. I felt a grim satisfaction as I tucked it into Rebecca's work bag while she was in the shower. That evening, as she left the house, I waited until her car disappeared down the street before pulling out my phone. I tracked her location using the app Joe had set up. Sure enough, she was headed to Edward's apartment. As later, Rebecca returned, her smile just as bright as ever. I pretended to be engrossed in a football game, barely glancing at her as she came in. Late again, I said casually. She laughed. You know how it is. These donors never stop talking. I nodded, keeping my tone light. Of course. You're doing important work. She kissed me on the cheek and went upstairs, leaving me alone in the living room. Once I was sure she was asleep, I retrieved the recorder from her bag and plugged it into my laptop. The audio started with nothing but the sound of the car engine, followed by some static as Rebecca adjusted her bag. Then came voices. Hers and Edward's. Did you tell him? Edward's voice was smooth, confident. No, Rebecca replied, her tone nervous. I can't. He'd never understand. Edward chuckled. Rebecca, you don't owe him anything. You've spent your whole life taking care of him. Isn't it time you did something for yourself? There was a pause, then Rebecca sighed. I need more time. Take all the time you need, Edward said. As long as you're here with me, that's all I care about. I clenched my fists as I listened. The casual intimacy in their voices, the way they spoke about me like I was some distant obstacle, it made my blood boil. But I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't the time for anger. This was the time for precision. The next day, I met Joe again. I've got the audio, I told him. It's more than enough. Joe nodded. So, what's the plan? I thought for a moment, the pieces falling into place in my mind. We're going to hit them where it hurts the most, I said. Publicly, where they can't deny anything. Joe raised an eyebrow. You talking about the fundraiser? I nodded. The foundation's biggest event of the year was just a week away, and Rebecca had been working tirelessly on it. Everyone important in her world, donors, board members, friends, would be there. It was the perfect stage. Let's make it count, I said, a grim smile spreading across my face. The week leading up to the fundraiser was one of the longest of my life. Rebecca seemed more excited than ever, her voice bright as she darted from one task to another. I watched her move around the house, answering calls and double-checking details like a woman possessed. We're going to raise more money this year than ever before, she said one morning, grinning as she jotted notes into her planner. The donors are so impressed with what we've done so far. It's going to be incredible. That's great, I replied, trying to keep my tone light. Rebecca barely noticed me as she left the kitchen to take another call. I sat there, staring at my coffee cup, feeling the weight of the folder in my office. It was still there, hidden away, filled with every ugly truth I didn't want to know but couldn't ignore. On the morning of the fundraiser, Rebecca woke up early, humming softly as she moved through the house. She spent extra time getting ready, curling her hair just the way she liked it, then slipping into a sleek black dress that fit her perfectly. How do I look? She asked, spinning slightly as she fastened a silver bracelet around her wrist. "Beautiful," I said. My voice sounded even, but inside, I felt like I was watching a stranger. She smiled, leaning in to kiss me on the cheek. "I'm heading out early to oversee the final setup. Don't forget to be there on time, okay?" "I'll be there," I said, watching her leave. The moment the door clicked shut, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the empty room. Then I grabbed my phone and called Joe. "Is everything ready?" I asked. "All set," he said. "You've got everything you need. You sure you're ready for this?" "Yeah," I replied, though my voice felt distant. "I'm ready." When I arrived at the venue that evening, the ballroom was already buzzing with energy. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, casting a warm glow on the elegantly dressed guests. Waiters weaved through the crowd with trays of champagne, and the sound of laughter filled the air. Rebecca was at the center of it all, her laugh ringing out above the conversations as she worked the room. Edward was by her side, his hand resting lightly on the back of her chair as they spoke with a group of donors. My stomach twisted at the sight of them together, but I forced myself to stay calm. I moved through the room, exchanging polite nods and handshakes with familiar faces. I listened to people praise Rebecca's hard work and dedication, their admiration for her almost glowing. If only they knew. The speeches began after dinner. Rebecca took the stage first, her smile radiant as she addressed the crowd. "Good evening, everyone," she said, her voice filled with pride. "Tonight, we celebrate the incredible work this foundation has accomplished. Thanks to your generosity, we've been able to make a real difference in the lives of so many families. Together, there's nothing we can't achieve." The applause was loud and heartfelt. Rebecca beamed as she stepped off the stage, her head held high, completely unaware of what was coming next. When the clapping died down, I stood and walked to the microphone. My heart was pounding in my chest, but my hands were steady as I adjusted the mic. "Good evening," I began, my voice calm but firm. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Michael Jameson. I'm Rebecca's husband." There were polite murmurs from the crowd, a few curious glances. I glanced toward Rebecca's table and saw the faintest flicker of confusion cross her face. Edward, sitting beside her, leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I want to take a moment to thank you all for supporting such an important cause," I continued. "The work this foundation does is truly remarkable, and it's thanks to your generosity that so many lives have been changed." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the room. Then I took a breath and clicked the remote in my hand. Behind me, the projector screen lit up. The first image appeared, Rebecca and Edward walking into his apartment together. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "This," I said, turning toward the screen, "is my wife and her colleague, Edward Miller. For months, they've been meeting in private, using foundation resources to fund their personal relationship." The room erupted in whispers and murmurs as I clicked to the next slide. This one showed receipts for dinners, hotel stays, and other expenses, all billed to the foundation. The money meant to help families in need, I continued, my voice sharper now, was spent on this. On them. Rebecca's face drained of color. She sat frozen at the table, her hands gripping the edge like it might keep her from falling apart. Edward, who had always seemed so confident, looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Around them, donors and board members exchanged furious glances. A few stood, demanding explanations. The room buzzed with outrage, their trust in the foundation shattered. I stepped away from the microphone, letting the crowd's reaction take over. My job was done. I didn't wait for Rebecca or Edward to defend themselves. Their excuses didn't matter anymore. As I walked out of the venue, the cold night air hit my face, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. As I walked to my car, the cold night air cut through me, but I barely felt it. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the door handle, the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. It was done. Everything I had planned for weeks, every piece of evidence, every moment of doubt and anger, it all led to this night. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel as my breathing slowed. The image of Rebecca's face, pale and frozen, played over and over in my mind. Edward's panic, the outrage of the donors, the gasps from the audience, it was a storm, and I had unleashed it. But instead of satisfaction, all I felt was emptiness. I stared out the windshield at the empty parking lot, the muffled sounds of the event still faintly audible in the background. A part of me wanted to stay and watch the chaos unfold, to see how Rebecca and Edward would try to explain themselves. But I didn't need to hear their excuses. I already knew the truth. The next morning, the fallout began. My phone buzzed constantly with messages, some from friends, others from people I barely knew. Word had spread fast. By the time I turned on the TV, the local news was already covering the story. Shocking allegations have surfaced regarding misuse of funds by key members of the Hope Foundation, the anchor announced, her expression serious. The screen cut to footage from the fundraiser. My voice echoed through the speakers as the images of Rebecca and Edward appeared on the screen. Even though I had orchestrated the whole thing, seeing it play out on TV made my stomach turn. I switched off the TV and tossed the remote onto the couch. This was just the beginning. By midday, Rebecca's calls started. The first one came just after noon. I watched her name light up on my phone, my finger hovering over the answer button. But I didn't pick up. What could she possibly say that would make any of this better? She called again an hour later. Then again. By the fourth call, she left a voicemail. Michael, her voice was shaky, almost unrecognizable. I don't even know where to start. Please, just call me back. We need to talk. I deleted the message without listening to the rest. Joe stopped by later that afternoon. He walked in with his usual steady demeanor, but his eyes were sharp, watching me closely as I poured us both a drink. Well, he said, taking a sip of his whiskey. You sure know how to make an impact. I let out a humorless laugh. It had to be done. Joe nodded, setting his glass down. And now? What's your plan? I shrugged, leaning back in my chair. I don't know. Move forward, I guess. Rebecca's not coming back here. That much is clear. He studied me for a moment, then said, You did the right thing, Michael. Don't let the aftermath make you second-guess that. I nodded, appreciating his words even if they didn't make me feel any better. The following days were a whirlwind. Rebecca moved out of the house without a word, leaving only a short note behind. I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say. I stared at the note for a long time before crumpling it in my hand. Sorry wasn't enough. It never would be. The Hope Foundation released a public statement, announcing that both Rebecca and Edward had been removed from their positions pending an investigation. The donors were furious, the board was scrambling, and everything Rebecca had worked for was falling apart. And yet, I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. The anger that had driven me for weeks was gone, replaced by a hollow ache I couldn't shake. One evening, I sat alone on the porch, a cold beer in hand. The neighborhood was quiet, the sun setting behind the trees. I looked out at the yard I had mowed 1,000 times, the porch I had built with my own hands, and wondered how everything had come to this. 30 years of marriage, gone. Not because of one mistake, but because of months, maybe years, of lies and betrayal. I took a long sip of my beer, letting the cool bitterness settle in my chest. I didn't know what the future would look like, but I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't the same man I had been a few weeks ago. And maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. The days after the fundraiser felt strangely quiet. The chaos I'd unleashed rippled outward, affecting everyone involved, yet my house remained still. Rebecca had moved out entirely by the end of the week. I hadn't asked where she was going, and she hadn't offered. Her note, those 3 short sentences, was the last thing she'd left behind. I found myself staring at her empty closet one afternoon, the hangers clinking softly as I pushed them aside. For 30 years, this had been our home. Now, it felt like a shell, stripped of meaning. But the silence wasn't unwelcome. It gave me space to think, to breathe, and to start piecing myself back together. By the following Monday, the fallout from the fundraiser had reached every corner of Rebecca's world. The foundation announced a formal investigation into financial misconduct, and both she and Edward were placed under immediate suspension. The news spread quickly, with local media picking up the story. My phone buzzed constantly with messages, some from friends checking in, others from people I hadn't heard from in years. "Good for you," one text read. "Took guts to do what you did." Another simply said, "Hope you're holding up." I appreciated the support, but it didn't change the emptiness I felt inside. I wasn't proud of what I'd done, even though I knew it was necessary. Joe came by that evening with a 6-pack of beer. He didn't say much at first, just handed me a bottle and sat down on the porch next to me. "You've been quiet," he said finally, his tone neutral. I shrugged. "Not much to say." Joe nodded, taking a long sip of his beer. "How's it feel?" "Now that it's over." I stared out at the yard, the sun casting long shadows across the grass. "I thought it would feel better," I admitted. "I thought?" "I don't know. That there'd be some kind of closure." "And there isn't?" I shook my head. "It just feels empty." Joe didn't respond right away. He tipped his bottle back, finishing the last of his beer before setting it down on the porch railing. "Closure's a tricky thing," he said. "It doesn't just show up because you want it to. You've got to make it for yourself." His words stuck with me long after he left. That night, I sat in the living room, surrounded by the remnants of a life that no longer felt like mine. The photos on the mantel, the couch Rebecca had picked out, even the smell of her perfume lingering faintly in the air, it was all a reminder of what I'd lost. But as the hours passed, a thought began to take shape. Maybe Joe was right. Maybe closure wasn't something that just happened. Maybe I had to create it. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in weeks. I started small, cleaning out the house, boxing up things that no longer felt like they belonged to me. Rebecca's shoes, her books, the throw pillows she loved so much, they all went into storage. I rearranged the furniture in the living room, moved the bed to the opposite wall in the bedroom. It wasn't much, but it felt like a start. Later that week, I drove out to a nearby park, a place I hadn't visited in years. It was one of those spots Rebecca and I used to go to when we first started dating. Back then, it had been a quiet escape from the world. Now, it felt like a place to reflect, to figure out what came next. I sat on a bench overlooking the lake, the water shimmering in the afternoon sunday. For the first time in a long time, I let myself think about the future. Not the past, not Rebecca, not Edward, just me. The idea of starting over was daunting, but as I sat there, watching the ducks glide across the water, I realized something: I wasn't trapped anymore. The house was eerily quiet after Rebecca left. I hadn't realized how much noise she brought to this place until she was gone. The clatter of her heels on the hardwood floors, the sound of her humming while she cleaned the kitchen, it was all gone now. At first, the silence felt suffocating. I'd catch myself pausing mid-step, expecting to hear her voice or see her car in the driveway. But nothing came. Just me, alone with my thoughts and the faint hum of the refrigerator. I tried keeping busy. Fixed the dripping faucet in the kitchen that Rebecca had been nagging me about for years. Mowed the lawn twice, even though it didn't need it. I even cleaned out the garage, something I hadn't done in at least a decade. But no matter how much I worked, the emptiness crept in during the quiet moments, like when I'd sit down for dinner and stare at the chair across from me. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I opened a bottle of bourbon that had been sitting in the cabinet since our last anniversary. It felt ironic, in a way. Pouring myself a drink from a bottle we'd saved for special occasions to toast the end of everything we'd built. I sat on the porch with that glass in hand, the cool night air wrapping around me. The stars were out, bright and clear, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself cry. Not a loud, dramatic cry, just quiet tears slipping down my cheeks as I thought about all the years, all the memories, and how it all came crashing down so quickly. The next morning, I woke up with a headache and a sense of determination. I couldn't stay stuck in this place forever. Rebecca had left, yes, but I was still here. And as much as it hurt, I knew I had to start moving forward. I started with the little things. Packed up the leftover boxes she hadn't bothered to take with her. An old scarf, a pair of shoes she'd left by the door, a book she'd been halfway through reading. I didn't throw them away, just packed them neatly into a box and shoved it into the garage. Out of sight, out of mind. After that, I tackled the rest of the house. Rearranged the furniture in the living room. Took down the framed photos in the hallway that felt too painful to look at. By the time I was done, the house looked different, not new, exactly, but mine. A few days later, I found myself scrolling through the community center's website. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, just something to get me out of the house. That's when I saw it, our woodworking class. I'd always loved working with my hands. Built this house from the ground up, after all. But it had been years since I'd done anything creative. Without thinking too much about it, I signed up. The first class was awkward. Most of the people there were young, college kids, mostly, but there was one woman, Carol, who looked about my age. She had an easy smile and kind eyes, and she made me feel less out of place. "You ever done this before?" she asked as we worked on sanding down our first project, a simple wooden box. "Not like this," I admitted. "But I've built a few things in my time." She laughed. "Well, you've got a steady hand. That's half the battle." By the end of the class, I'd managed to finish my box. It wasn't perfect, one of the corners didn't quite line up, but I felt proud of it anyway. Carol complimented my work, and for the first time in weeks, I found myself smiling. Over the next few weeks, the class became something I looked forward to. It gave me a sense of purpose, something to focus on other than what I'd lost. Carol and I struck up a friendship, and though I wasn't sure where it might lead, it felt good to have someone to talk to. One evening after class, as we packed up our tools, she asked, "What got you into this?" I hesitated, not sure how much I wanted to share. But then I shrugged. Needed something to keep me busy. House got real quiet after my wife left. She didn't pry, just nodded sympathetically. I get it. Starting over isn't easy. No, I agreed, but maybe it's necessary. As I drove home that night, the sky darkening around me, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time, a hope. It's funny how life slows down when you're alone. Days feel longer, meals quieter, even the way the house sounds changes. After Rebecca left, I noticed everything, the hum of the fridge, the soft groan of the floorboards when I walked across them, the way the light shifted through the windows in the afternoon. I used to overlook these things. Now, they felt like my only companions. I'd started spending more time on the porch. Morning coffee, evening beer, it didn't matter. It was a place where the world felt simpler. My vegetable garden was growing stronger every day. The tomatoes were ripening, and the herbs smelled fresh whenever I brushed past them. It wasn't much, but it was something alive, something to take care of. The woodworking class became my anchor. At first, it was just a way to get out of the house, but now, it felt like more. The sound of saws and hammers, the smell of sawdust, it was comforting. Carol was always there, a steady presence with her easy smile and kind words. One night, as we were packing up, she glanced over at me and said, "You know, you've gotten a lot better at this. I laughed, holding up the small shelf I'd made. That's because I've finally figured out how to follow instructions. She grinned. Next thing you know, you'll be teaching the class. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, I said, shaking my head. But her words lingered as I drove home that night. That weekend, I decided to revisit the hiking trail Rebecca and I used to love. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I wanted to see if it still felt the same, or maybe I just needed to prove to myself that I could go there alone. The trail was exactly how I remembered it, down to the smell of pine needles and the worn wooden signs marking the path. The climb was harder than it used to be, but when I reached the overlook, the view was as beautiful as ever. I sat on a rock at the edge, staring out at the valley below. For the first time in years, the memories didn't hurt. They were just memories. I pulled out my phone and snapped a photo, not because I needed to, but because it felt right to capture the moment. At the next woodworking class, I showed the picture to Carol. "Wow," she said, leaning in to get a closer look. "That's gorgeous. You go there a lot?" "Used to," I replied. "Haven't been in years." "You should," she said, smiling. "It looks like the kind of place you could think clearly." "It is," I said, hesitating for a moment before adding, "You should come with me sometime." The words surprised even me, but Carol didn't seem caught off guard. She just smiled and said, "I'd like that." Life didn't transform overnight. There were still bad days, moments when the house felt too empty, when I caught myself thinking about Rebecca or wondering if things could have been different. But those moments didn't define me anymore. I started saying yes to things I never would have before. Volunteering at the community center. Joining a book club, of all things. Going out for coffee with Carol after class. Even signing up for a 5K run, though halfway through training, I wondered what I'd been thinking. Each small step felt like a victory, a reminder that life didn't have to stop because one chapter ended. One evening, I sat on the porch with a beer, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in soft oranges and pinks, and for the first time, I let myself just sit there and appreciate it. Rebecca's betrayal had broken something in me, but it had also forced me to rebuild. And in the process, I'd discovered parts of myself I hadn't seen in years, parts one thought were gone forever. The future still felt uncertain, but now, it wasn't something to fear. It was something to look forward to. For the first time in a long time, I was ready.